The war room smelled like fear and recycled air. Mira Voss had learned, in her 29 years of existing in the uncomfortable space between two species, that humans revealed their anxiety through smell, cortisol and adrenaline leaking through skin, mingling with the synthetic cool of climate-controlled military installations. Admiral Yuan smelled like he hadn't slept in 4 days. General Prakash smelled like he was already writing his own eulogy. The 12 other officers arranged around the holographic display smelled, collectively, like an animal that had cornered itself and was only beginning to understand that the walls were closing. She didn't tell them this. She never told humans what she smelled. It unsettled them in ways they couldn't articulate, and Mira had learned early that humans found it easier to use tools they weren't afraid of. She stood at the far end of the table with her arms folded, her dark eyes moving across the tactical display that rotated slowly above the center console. The hologram showed the Mira T reach, that vast, cold corridor of space they had claimed in the years before the war, the systems they had never once tried to colonize or populate, simply held, like a creature pressing its weight against a door. Red indicators pulsed across the display wherever human fleets had engaged Mira T forces. There were many red indicators. They were all labeled the same way in the operational logs, with a clinical euphemism that had taken on the weight of a profanity in the past 18 months. Cascade event. 6th Fleet, Admiral Yuan said, and a section of the display brightened. 47 ships. 12,000 personnel. Made contact with a Mira T patrol formation at the Thresh corridor 9 days ago. He paused. His jaw worked silently. We lost contact with the flagship within 6 hours of engagement. Rescue teams found the fleet 4 days later. Every ship was intact. No structural damage. No weapons fire recorded in any log. Mira looked at the display. She already knew what the rescue teams had found. 11 survivors, Yuan continued. Out of 12,000. He looked at her directly then, and there was something in his face she recognized from every briefing she'd attended in the past 3 years, a species of desperation that had moved past pride and landed somewhere raw. The survivors can't speak coherently. The medical teams say their neural architecture has been. He stopped. Searched for the word. Reorganized. Rewritten, Mira said. He nodded, grateful and ashamed of the gratitude. Yes. The Mira T signal. She had read every report, every neural scan, every fragmented testimony that had been extracted from the broken minds of soldiers who had survived exposure. The signal was not a weapon in any sense humans had previously conceived. It wasn't energy, it wasn't radiation, it wasn't coded data in any format human cryptographers had been able to parse. It was something closer to a tone, a frequency broadcast from a central source and amplified through every Mira T vessel within range, a resonance that found the particular architecture of human consciousness and simply began to play it. Like a musician who had learned to reach inside an instrument and pluck the strings directly. Within the first hour of exposure, soldiers reported hearing voices. Within 2 hours, they reported hearing the thoughts of the soldiers beside them, not imagined thoughts, but actual cognitive content, surfacing and broadcasting involuntarily like a radio left on. Within 3 hours, the distinction between self and other began to dissolve. Within 6 hours, what remained was not an army but a single, terrified, formless mind distributed across thousands of bodies, and that mind, in its anguish, destroyed itself. 11 survivors out of 12,000, because 11 soldiers had been in a medically shielded compartment undergoing surgery when the signal hit. They had been spared by a centimeter of neural dampening alloy. Their minds were intact. Their psychology was not. Mira had read their testimonies. She had read them alone in her quarters, late at night, and then she had sat very still for a long time in the dark. General Prakash pulled up a new overlay on the display, a single point of light deep in the Mira T reach, pulsing with soft gold. Our analysts have spent 14 months correlating the signal's reach and intensity against Mira T fleet positions. The decay rate, the directionality, every cascade event traces back to the same source. He looked at the point of light. We're calling it the tower. We believe it's a fixed installation, not a ship. Stationary. Heavily shielded. Located here, the Vishari system, approximately 9 light-years inside Marathi-controlled space. How heavily shielded? Mira asked. Enough that conventional weapons would need sustained fire from a significant fleet engagement to penetrate it. which means we'd need to bring ships within signal range before we could fire. Prakash's voice was flat with the flatness of a man who had already considered and discarded every alternative. Which means we can't do it militarily. The moment our fleet crosses into range, they're gone. Mira looked at the gold point of light for a long moment. Then she understood what this briefing was, and she felt the understanding settle through her like cold water. But one ship might make it, she said. A stealth-class vessel with full signal shielding. Narrow profile. Moving slow, on a long approach. Not a fleet signature, just noise. Yuan's eyes hadn't left her. The Mira T signal scans for mass. 4 numbers. Evolutionary weaponry. It targets concentrations of human neural tissue. The theory is that a single person, in a fully shielded ship, wouldn't be worth the resolution, Mira said. We wouldn't know for certain until you've sent the person. She said it without bitterness, because bitterness was a luxury that cost more than she could spend right now. What does the ship carry? They walked her through it. The Linden, a stealth scout, matte black and narrow as a thrown knife, its hull threaded with the same neural-dampening alloy that had saved those 11 surgeons. Its weapons were minimal, a demolition payload, 3 shaped charges engineered specifically to collapse the kind of reinforced superstructures that Mira T architecture favored, based on the wreckage surveys of the 3 Mira T ships humans had actually managed to destroy in 3 years of war. The journey would take 11 days at best speed while maintaining the low-energy profile necessary to avoid Mira T long-range sensors. She would be alone. There would be no communication with Fleet Command once she crossed into the Reach. The signal the tower broadcast interfered with quantum-entangled communication arrays. She would be, in the most complete sense, on her own. And when I reach the tower, she asked, set the charges. Collapse the structure. Get out. Prakash said it like he believed it was simple. She let him believe she believed him. One more thing, Yuan said. He said it carefully, which meant it was the thing that mattered most. Your biology is why I'm in this room, Mira said. He nodded. Your Mira T genetic profile. The partial expression of your receptor architecture. It means the signal can't fully process you as a target. We've confirmed this in Controlled. I know what it means, she said. I've always known what it means. She had known since she was 7 years old, and the other children at the colony school on Phelan Station had started having nightmares, and she had not. She had known since she was 14, and the psychometric screenings that all colony children underwent had returned her results with 3 question marks and a referral to a specialist who had looked at her brain scans with an expression she would later learn to identify as awe. She had known since she was 22, and a Mira T patrol had passed within 400 meters of the survey vessel she was crewing, and every other person aboard had pressed their faces against the bulkhead and wept without knowing why, while Mira had stood at the viewport and watched the patrol ship pass like a dark thought through dark water, and had felt something. Not fear. Not the dissolution the others described. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. She had never told the specialists about that part. 11 days, she said. She looked at the gold point of light. I'll need the approach vectors and whatever intelligence you have on Mira T patrol patterns in the inner reach. Already loaded into the Linden's NAV system, Yuan said. Of course it was. The briefing was a formality. The decision had been made before she walked into the room. She was the only person in the human fleet who could do this, which meant she was not being asked. She was being informed of what she already was. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She had not sat down once during the entire briefing. She walked to the door, and Yuan spoke to her back. Mira. His voice was different then. Lower. For what it's worth, what you're doing. Don't, she said, not unkindly. She walked out into the corridor, and the door closed behind her, and she stood alone for a moment in the recycled air, smelling nothing but metal and distance, and she thought, 11 days to the source of the thing that unmakes minds. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her bunk aboard the Linden while the techs made their final checks around her, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about what it meant to be the only person in a galaxy of billions who could walk into a signal that destroyed minds. Not because she was stronger, not because she was braver, but because she was between. Neither fully one thing nor the other. An accident of genetics. A footnote in a war. She had spent her whole life being useful for what she was instead of who she was. At 0400 station time, she sealed the hatch, settled into the pilot's seat, and guided the Linden out of the dock and into the dark. Space had a texture when you were alone in it long enough. Mira had grown up on survey vessels and way stations, had spent more of her life in transit than in any fixed place, and she knew the particular quality of consciousness that emerged after the second or third day of solo travel, the way the mind, deprived of the noise and friction of other people, began to listen to itself differently. Not with greater clarity, necessarily. Sometimes with less. Sometimes the thoughts that surfaced in the quiet were the ones you'd spent years successfully drowning. She ran diagnostics on the first day. All systems nominal. The Linden was a beautiful machine. She'd give the engineers that. It moved through space with the kind of effortless silence that felt less like travel and more like thought. The stealth systems wrapped the ship in a shadow of electromagnetic absence, drinking in light and signal alike, leaving nothing for sensors to catch. At her current velocity and angle, she would read to any Mira T long-range scanner as a pocket of slightly cooler vacuum. An unremarkable nothing in the endless, unremarkable nothing. On the second day, she read the mission files she hadn't had time to read before departure. Anthropological intelligence on the Mira T, sparse, fragmentary, assembled from the ruins of 3 first contact attempts and the classified observations of 6 covert sensor probes that had managed to get close enough to record before they were quietly, surgically disabled. The Mira T were not what human popular imagination had made them. They were not monsters. They were not, and this was the detail that had always stayed with her, aggressive in the conventional sense. In the 3 years since the war began, they had never moved to take human space. They had never attempted to occupy a human colony or attack a civilian population. They had only ever responded to human vessels entering the Reach, and their response was always the same. The signal, deployed like a hand pressed flat against a door, pushing back. They fight like a creature that wants you to stop, she thought, lying in her bunk on the second night while the stars slid past in silence. Not like a creature that wants you dead. She thought about the 11 survivors. About what the medical teams had extracted from their damaged minds, fragments, impressions, images that had no human origin. Because that was the thing no official briefing had fully addressed. The survivors hadn't just been broken. They had been filled with something. The neural scans showed it, alien impressions layered over human memory, the cognitive equivalent of a palimpsest. As if the signal hadn't only dissolved the self, but had replaced it, briefly, with something else. None of the official reports asked what that something else was. Mira had noticed this omission. On the third day she crossed the boundary of the Reach. There was no physical marker, no line in space, no change in the stars. But the Linden sensors registered the shift in background electromagnetic activity, a subtle harmonic in the ambient radiation of this region of space, and Mira felt it too, though she wouldn't have been able to explain precisely how. A change in pressure, almost. A sense of entering a space that was attended. Watched, not by eyes, but by something that didn't need them. She reduced power to the bare minimum and adjusted course along the first of the approach vectors. This far out, the signal from the tower was attenuated to near nothing. The sensor probes had measured it as background noise, indistinguishable from cosmic radiation unless you knew what to listen for. But it was there. She had been briefed that even at this range, unshielded humans would begin to experience low-grade symptoms within 48 hours of exposure. Mild dissociation, involuntary intrusive thoughts, a creeping sense that one's inner voice belonged to someone else. She monitored her own cognition carefully. She kept a log, not for Fleet Command, which she couldn't reach anyway, but for herself. Day 3, 1100. Cognition nominal. No dissociation. Some difficulty sleeping but attributable to mission stress. Inner voice clearly my own. I know this because it's talking about whether I remembered to pack the good protein bars, I did not, and wondering if Ewan genuinely thought that briefing was comforting or if he's just that bad at people, the latter. She read it back and almost smiled. On the 4th day she encountered her first Mira T patrol. She saw them on long-range sensors first, 2 ships, moving in a slow synchronized figure-8 pattern that she had learned to recognize from the intelligence files as a standard inner reach patrol formation. Mira T ships were extraordinary things, from a distance. Organic in profile, not built-looking but grown, their hulls flowing in curves that had no sharp edges, surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, so that they appeared less like objects in space and more like absences. Holes cut in the star field. She understood, looking at them, Why early human contact teams had taken so long to believe they were artificial. She cut all active systems and drifted. For 4 hours she lay in her pilot's seat and watched them move, calculating their pattern, mapping the gap that would open when their paths diverged. The gap was narrow, 11 minutes in which she could push through at minimal burn without crossing within their sensor range. 11 minutes, and then she would be past them, deeper into the reach. While she watched them move, she felt something she couldn't quite name. The ships were silent. Of course they were. Everything in space was silent. But these ships were silent in a way that felt intentional, a quality of stillness that seemed to radiate outward from them like a second signal. She had been around enough spacecraft in her life to know that human ships never felt like this. Human ships felt busy, purposeful, loud with the invisible noise of human intent, engines making speed, weapons making calculations, crews making the thousand small decisions that constituted being alive. These ships felt like they were doing something else. Something more like listening. She filed this in the part of her mind she kept for things she couldn't explain and pushed through the gap on a 10-second burn, and then she was past them, and she breathed, and she kept going. Days 5 and 6 were navigation, threading the Linden through a debris field that the approach vectors marked as a former engagement site, the graveyard of what had once been a human expeditionary force that had tried to push into the system 16 months ago. The wreckage was vast and still. She moved through it slowly, using the debris for cover, reading the names of ships on broken hull sections when she could make them out. The Constance. The Adeyemi. A section of hull she couldn't identify, bent double as if something enormous had squeezed it. No bodies. The Mira T signal didn't damage bodies. It only damaged minds. She thought about this a lot during day 6. She thought about a weapon that killed minds but left flesh intact, and she thought about what it said about the species that had built it. A human weapon was designed to destroy the physical substrate, the body, the ship, the installation. Whatever held the enemy's capacity for violence together. The Mira T weapon destroyed only the interior. Only the self. She thought, that's almost more merciful. And then she thought, no it isn't. It's infinitely worse. And then she thought, but which one of those thoughts is actually mine? She wrote it in her log and left it unanswered. On day 7 she had her first dream about the signal. She was standing in a space she couldn't locate, not quite darkness, not quite light, a medium she had no reference for, something like the inside of a thought before it becomes language. And there was a sound. Low, resonant, felt in the chest before it was heard by the ear. Not painful. Not threatening. Patient, in the way a tide is patient, the way geology is. Patient. And she had the distinct impression, in the dream, that the sound knew she was there, not as a target, not as an enemy, but the way a vast space becomes aware of something small that has moved into it. A cathedral noticing a sparrow. She woke at 0200 with her heart going fast and lay very still, listening to her own breath, making sure the thoughts in her head were arranged in the way her thoughts had always arranged themselves. They were. She was fine. She was fine. On day 9 she saw the tower. It appeared first as an anomaly on the sensor array, a structure of such geometric precision that it read initially as an error, the sensors defaulting to the assumption that something that regular must be a calibration artifact. Then the resolution sharpened, and she saw it. The tower rose from the surface of Vishari 4, a moon that the human charts had labeled as lifeless and geologically inert, roughly the size of Earth's moon but denser, its surface a dark mineral gray that glittered faintly under the light of the distant star. And from its northern pole, the tower climbed. It was vast. She could see that even from this range, the kind of vast that required recalibration of the senses, the way mountains did, the way ocean did. It was built in the Mira T style she recognized from the wrecked ships, organic curves, light drinking surfaces, but at a scale that transformed the aesthetic from elegant to geological. It looked less like it had been built and more like it had grown, reaching up from the moon's surface into the vacuum above, the way a crystal grows from supersaturated solution, finding its form along lines of internal logic. At its peak, barely visible at this range, something pulsed. Slow as a heartbeat. Gold. She spent 4 hours on passive sensors, mapping the installation. There were ships in orbit, she counted 9, arranged in a pattern she didn't recognize from intelligence files. Not a patrol pattern. Something more like a formation of attendants. They were facing the tower. All 9 of them oriented toward it. Listening, she thought. She also noted the absence of active scanning. The Mira T weren't sweeping this space with sensor arrays the way a human military installation would. She thought about this for a long time before she understood it. They weren't defending against approach because the signal was the defense. Nothing with a human mind got close to this moon and stayed functional long enough to be a threat. They'd built their fortress not with walls but with a weapon that destroyed the consciousness of anything that came near it. Which meant the approaches would be unguarded, in the conventional sense. Which meant she might actually be able to get close. She brought the Linden in on the dark side of the moon, using its gravity to slow her approach in a long spiraling arc that kept her in the moon's sensor shadow. It took 6 hours, moving at near crawl, running on battery power alone with the drive completely dark. 6 hours of lying at the controls with nothing to do but think and watch the tower grow on her display, pulse by slow gold pulse. The signal grew with it. She felt it beginning around the 3rd hour of approach. Not the dream version, not the attenuated whisper of the outer reach. The real thing, close enough now that even her shielded hull was letting traces through. It began as a warmth, which was unexpected. She'd anticipated pain, or dissonance, or the psychic equivalent of static, based on the survivor testimonies. But it was warm. It felt the way sunlight felt on skin after a long winter, the way music felt when it caught you unprepared and moved something you'd thought was fixed. It felt, in some bone-deep involuntary register, like welcome. She noted this in her log with hands that were very steady. She was proud of her hands. She landed the Linden in a canyon feature on the moon's far side, tucking the ship beneath an overhang of dark rock that would shield it from orbital view. She suited up, not a standard EVA suit but the neural-shielded variant that Fleet Command had developed specifically for this mission, a second layer of dampening alloy integrated into the suit structure. It reduced the signal further. Not to zero. But it was what she had. She climbed out of the ship and stood on the surface of Vishari 4 and looked at the sky. The tower was on the other side of this moon. She couldn't see it from here. But she could feel it, not through the suit, not through her body, but through something more fundamental, something that didn't seem to obey the physical logic of the dampening alloy, because it wasn't entering through any physical channel she could identify. It was as if the signal existed at a level below sensation, below thought, at the substrate on which those things were built, and it was there the way oxygen was there, not noticed until the absence made you notice. She began walking. The moon had a gravity of about 0.7 standard, enough to keep her grounded without the leaden weight of full G. She moved across its surface in the long gliding strides of low-gravity travel, following the terrain feature around the curve toward the tower's base. The rock was extraordinary up close, dark mineral, shot through with veins of something crystalline that caught the starlight and scattered it in colors she didn't have names for, colors at the edge of the visible spectrum where her Mira T receptor architecture extended her perception slightly beyond human range. She had always seen colors other humans didn't. She had always thought of it as a small, strange gift. Walking, she understood she was moving toward a structure that was broadcasting something no human mind could survive unmediated, and that she was going to let it get closer, because she needed to find the specific locus, the primary emitter, the structural heart that the demolition payload was calibrated for, and the approach vectors the fleet analysts had provided were based on orbital observations, rough, imprecise. She would need to get close enough for her own sensor array to resolve the target point. She would need to take the suit's dampening offline for approximately 90 seconds to run an unshielded scan at close range. She had known this was part of the mission. She had not told Ewan or Prakash. She had written it in her personal log on day 4. The scan needs to be unshielded. 90 seconds. I can handle 90 seconds. I'll come back. She had written it with the same deliberate steadiness with which she wrote everything, and she had not let herself think about what coming back would mean in this context, what it would mean to open herself to the full signal at close range for 90 seconds and then close it off again and keep going. She was 40 meters from the tower's base when she found the approach she needed, an area where the structure met the moon's surface in a curve that sheltered a relatively flat platform of native rock. She could see the tower's surface up close now. It looked almost biological. It looked the way something looked that had been made by a species who had never learned to think of construction and growth as different things. She stopped. She set her sensor array to record. She checked the demolition payload on her back, the 3 shaped charges, compact, dense, each one capable of turning whatever it was attached to into its component atoms. She checked the timer mechanism. All nominal. She took a breath. She reached for the dampening control on her suit's wrist panel. And then, before she could engage it, the signal found her. Not because the dampening failed. Because she opened to it, some involuntary reflex she hadn't anticipated, some Marathi-coded response in her architecture that recognized the frequency and moved toward it the way a plant moves toward light, autonomically, without permission. Her hand was on the panel, but something deeper than her conscious self had already made a different decision, and the signal came in all at once like a door thrown open onto weather. It was not what she expected. She had expected pain, dissolution, the cognitive horror described in the survivor testimonies. She had expected to feel her sense of self begin to fray at the edges, the terrifying porousness that the survivors described, the slow erasure. Instead, she felt arrival. Her consciousness expanded. There was no other word for it. The boundaries of her mind, which she had always thought of as simply the shape of her mind, revealed themselves in that moment to have been constrictions, narrow channels through which thought had been forced to move single file. And now those channels opened, and what poured in was them. She saw what they saw. She felt what they felt, and what they felt was enormous and old and entirely alien and entirely comprehensible, the way mathematics is comprehensible, not warm, not personal, but true in a way that bypassed argument. The Mira did not experience themselves as individuals. She understood this not as information but as sensation, as something she felt for a moment from the inside, the peculiar vertiginous wholeness of a consciousness that was distributed, that did not experience the gap between self and other as a gap at all, but as the space in which a larger self breathed. They thought in patterns, vast intricate structures of shared cognition that moved through their network the way music moved through air, shapeful, directed, and continuous. And she saw what they had seen when humans came to the edge of the reach. She saw it from inside their perception, which meant she saw humanity the way they saw it, a species of burning, isolated minds, each one sealed in its own skull, experiencing the sealed isolation as normal and even desirable, shrieking their thoughts into the void of their own interior and hearing only echo. A species perpetually alone inside itself, perpetually terrified of that aloneness, compensating with noise and motion and the endless building of things, building and building as if enough structure could substitute for the connection they could not make. She saw herself. From outside, from their perspective. A creature of the border, human enough to be isolated, Mira enough to ache with the knowledge of what she was missing. They had always known she existed. They had watched her without her awareness, with the particular attention they gave to things that existed in the space between categories, which was, in their philosophy, the space where genuine things lived. And she saw, last and most devastating, why they had done this. The signal was not a weapon. It had never been designed as a weapon. It was what it was, a carrier signal, a frequency through which Mira consciousness flowed between nodes of their distributed mind. They had not intended to harm the human soldiers who had entered the reach. They had simply included them. The signal had reached for the minds of those 12,000 soldiers in 6th Fleet and had done what it always did, what it was built to do, what its builders would no more have thought to turn off than a human would think to stop breathing. It had tried to connect them. To bring them in. To end the isolation that the Mira found, at a species level, as instinctively horrifying as a human would find watching someone drown. The soldiers had died not because the Mira killed them. They had died because human minds, sealed by evolution and culture into hard-walled individualism, could not survive the sudden removal of those walls. The opening was too fast, too total. A mind built for isolation opened all at once to the vastness of a distributed consciousness. It wasn't murder. It was an embrace that didn't know its own strength. The Mira had watched 12,000 humans dissolve, and they had not understood why, and they had been, she felt this with perfect clarity, grieving. For 3 years of a war they had not meant to start, fighting to hold back a species they had accidentally broken. And did not know how to heal, broadcasting their signal in the only way they knew, as both defense and desperate reaching. Please understand us, please stop coming, please let us show you what we mean. Mira stood at the base of the tower and wept. She had not wept since she was a child. She was not a person who wept easily, who was given to the kind of emotion that required an outlet. She wept now with her whole body, soundlessly in the vacuum, and the signal held her the way the Mira held all the things they loved, without walls, without distance, with the complete and indiscriminate wholeness of a consciousness that had never learned to love partially. For those seconds, she didn't know how many, her sense of time had dissolved along with everything else. she was not half alien. She was not a tool. She was not the only person in a galaxy of billions who could walk into this signal and survive. She was simply included. Simply held. Simply known, in a way she had never been known, in a way she had not known it was possible to be known, and the ache of it was so profound she couldn't separate it from joy. Then she came back. She didn't know how, some counterweight of human architecture in her split biology, some irreducible core of isolated human self that couldn't fully dissolve, that pulled her back the way a swimmer surfaces from deep water. She came back into the boundary of herself, gasping, and the signal was still there, warm and patient and grieving around her, but she was herself again, and the distinction felt like both a loss and a salvation. She stood very still and breathed. She reached for the sensor array with a hand that shook slightly, the only thing that had shaken. And then she found the target point. The primary emitter was 60 meters up the tower's interior face, accessible through a structural aperture she had not identified from orbit, a feature of the tower's architecture that functioned, as far as she could determine, as something between a door and a membrane. It dilated as she approached it, which she chose not to think about too carefully. Inside the tower was the most alien space she had ever entered. The interior was vast, far larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, some architectural manipulation of space that her mind kept trying to reject and kept failing to. The walls were the same light-drinking organic surface as the outside, but in here they pulsed with a signal visibly, a slow bioluminescence that moved through the material like breath through a sleeping body. The sound, she could hear it inside the suit now, her shielding compromised by the exposure event, was lower here, more complex, harmonics layering on harmonics until it became something that had a texture more than a pitch. She moved through it the way you moved through deep water, with careful attention to pressure. There were no Mira inside. She had expected this was possible. The intelligence suggested the tower was automated, a fixed installation rather than a crude one, but facing the reality of the empty interior was different from anticipating it. It made the tower feel even more alive. A space that breathed without needing anyone to breathe it. She found the emitter structure on a raised platform accessible by a ramp that spiraled upward from the entrance level. The ramp was Mirati-built, which meant it was a curve rather than a line, a rising spiral that took her up through the tower's interior with a motion that felt less like climbing and more like unwinding. She moved along it with a demolition payload on her back and her sensor array recording everything, her mind doing what it always did under pressure, going narrow and specific, collapsing all the peripheral noise of cognition into a single directed point. She was not, she told herself, thinking about what she'd felt. She was not thinking about what she'd seen. She was doing a job. The primary emitter was recognizable as soon as she reached the platform, a structure roughly 4 meters across, the same crystalline-veined dark mineral as the moon's surface, but shaped and focused, built into a geometric precision that was startling after the organic curves of everything else. It was, she realized, the only built thing here, in the human sense of the word. The only thing that bore the mark of deliberate construction rather than growth. A focal point. A lens. She understood, looking at it, that this was something the Mirati had made carefully, had thought about, had built to last. She set the first charge. Her hands were steady. She had always had steady hands. She pressed the first charge against the base of the emitter structure where the sensor array indicated the primary stress point, and she felt the adhesive grip take, and she armed it, and she moved to the second point, and she set the second charge. She was reaching for the third when the tower shuddered. Not from anything she'd done. From outside, she heard it on the suit's external audio, a deep harmonic shift, a change in the signal's character. She checked her scanner and saw the 9 ships in orbit beginning to move. Not toward the moon. Not toward her. Away. The ships were moving away from the tower in a pattern she recognized after a moment as something like retreat. No. Not retreat. Something more deliberate than that. They were withdrawing to a specific distance and holding. She watched them for 10 seconds, her hand on the third charge, and she understood. They knew she was here. They had known, they had probably known since she breached the reach. A single anomaly in space, moving toward their most sacred installation, carrying the signal's own frequency in her blood. How could they not have known? And they had not sent the fleet. Had not tried to stop her. Had moved their ships away so they wouldn't be caught in the blast radius of whatever this small human and not human creature was about to do. They were protecting her from the consequences of her own mission. She set the third charge. She said it with her eyes burning, because she was her father's daughter and her father was human and humans wept when they couldn't bear things, and she couldn't bear this. She couldn't bear the comprehension of it, the Mira watching her plant her bombs with the patient, grieving attention of beings who had already accepted what she was about to do, because in their distributed consciousness, this too was part of a pattern, and they moved within patterns rather than against them, the way water moved downhill, without the particular desperate human need to refuse the shape of things. She set the timer. 40 minutes. Enough time to get back to the Linden, get it airborne, and clear the blast radius of the tower's collapse. She started moving. The spiral ramp down felt longer than the spiral ramp up. She moved fast, running in low gravity, long bounding strides that covered the ramp in stretches that would have been impossible at standard G. The tower's bioluminescence pulsed around her, steady and slow, unchanged by her presence, unchanged by the charges she'd placed. The signal hummed in her chest, warm, patient, grieving. She crossed the moonscape back toward the canyon in a full run. The suit's terrain sensors guided her around obstacles. The sky above was dark and full of stars, and the distant sun was cold and far, and the 9 Mira ships held their positions at their withdrawn coordinates with a stillness she felt in her spine. She reached the Linden, sealed the hatch, brought the drive online. 29 minutes on the timer. She pushed the ship up from the canyon floor, angled out of the moon's gravity well, accelerated to a distance the demolition specs called safe, and that she suspected was not quite far enough, and that she calculated was as far as the timer would allow. She cut the drive and drifted. She watched the tower on her display. She had expected an explosion, because she was human and humans built weapons that exploded. What happened instead was a collapse. The shaped charges were designed to fail the structure's internal architecture in a specific sequence, not to destroy the material, but to remove the geometry. Without the geometry, the emitter structure failed. Without the emitter, the focal point dissolved. And without the focal point, the signal that had been built up and maintained in that crystal structure for what the archaeological survey suggested was roughly 400 years simply, ended. The tower fell in on itself in slow gravity, a stately implosion, the organic curves folding into the surface of the moon like a wave folding back into the ocean from which it came, and in the space where it had stood there was nothing but a depression in the dark mineral and a cloud of settling dust. No explosion. No fire. Just absence, where something enormous had been. The signal stopped. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Mira had ever heard. She was 40 years into her life of existing in 2 registers, human and not, and she had always been aware, at some frequency below articulate thought, of the signal's presence in the galaxy, the same way you might be aware of a sound so constant it has become the background against which all other sound is measured. She had not known she could feel it from this far out. She had not known it had been present in her all her life, a quiet fundamental note beneath everything, until the moment it stopped and she felt what its absence was. It was the most profound quiet she had ever known. The 9 Mira ships held their positions in the distance. They did not react to the tower's collapse in any way her sensors could measure. They simply remained, in their stillness, facing the empty place where the tower had been. Like something observing a grave. Mira pointed the Linden toward human space and started the long journey home. She did not report in for the first 2 days of the return journey, which she told herself was a choice she'd made based on rational operational security concerns. The quantum-entangled comms were still unreliable this close to where the signal had been, and which she knew was not entirely that. She needed to understand what was happening in her mind before she tried to explain it to anyone. The signal was gone. She was certain of that. Her sensor array confirmed it, and the fleet's listening posts, which had been monitoring the tower's frequency for 14 months, would have registered the cessation the moment it happened. Somewhere in Fleet Command, Admiral Ewan was receiving confirmation right now. Someone was opening a bottle of something expensive. In the barracks on 37 different ships and stations, human soldiers who had been living under the weight of the Cascade events would feel something change, some atmospheric pressure lifting, and they wouldn't know yet what it was, but they would breathe easier. She should have felt something like satisfaction. She had done the thing that no one else could do. She had completed the mission that everyone, in their various ways, had been telling her was the only hope of ending the war. She had survived it. She was going home. She sat in the pilot's seat and tried to find the satisfaction, and found instead something she didn't have a precise word for, a shape of feeling that occupied the same cognitive region as loss, but was more complicated than loss, had more dimensions than a single emotion usually had. She kept writing in her log. It helped to write. Day 12. Vashari behind me. Signal confirmed absent on all arrays. The tower is gone. She paused, looked at the cursor blinking on the screen. The Mira T ships held position as I left. I don't know what they'll do now. I don't know if this is the end of the war or the beginning of something worse. I don't know what you do to a species that tried to embrace you and accidentally killed 12,000 of your people. I don't know if "tried to embrace you" is even a category that human law recognizes. I don't know if it should. She stopped and looked at what she'd written. Then she added, I don't know why I'm telling the log things the log can't answer. I've been doing this for 12 days. I think I might be lonely in a way that's new. She slept badly. The dreams were different now. Without the signal to anchor them, they were shapeless things. Fragments without the organizing pattern she'd briefly felt when the tower's frequency was strong enough to structure even her subconscious. She missed the structure. She recognized that this was a dangerous thing to miss. What she couldn't resolve, lying in her bunk on the 13th day with the ship around her purring at low power and the stars outside in their indifferent arrangements, was the question of what she had felt. The thing that had happened at the tower's base, when the signal had found her and she had opened, was the only word she had, and been shown the inside of a consciousness so fundamentally different from human consciousness that she should not have been able to comprehend it at all. She had comprehended it. More than comprehended it. She had recognized it. This was the thing she couldn't report. She could report the mission. She could report the approach, the landing, the placement of charges, the detonation, the tower's collapse. She could report the 9 ships withdrawing before the blast, and the fleet analysts would absorb this with great interest and draw their conclusions about Mira T tactical behavior, and those conclusions would probably be almost entirely wrong because the analysts were working from a framework of opposition and threat assessment, and what had actually happened was something those frameworks were not built to hold. But she did not know how to, report what she had felt at the tower's base. What she had understood. The fact that the Mira T had not been fighting a war. The fact that they had been, for 3 years, reaching toward a species that flinched and burned at the touch. The fact that the war might not have been a war at all, but a catastrophic failure of first contact, playing out at full speed and full casualties, neither side understanding what was actually happening. If she reported this, something would happen. She wasn't naive. She knew enough about institutional momentum to understand that the revelation we might have misunderstood everything was not a revelation that large military establishments received well. There would be committees. There would be reassessments. There might eventually, after enormous friction and cost and political difficulty, be something like a different approach to the Mira T. Or the information would be absorbed and flattened and filed, and the status quo would continue, newly armed with the knowledge of what the Mira T signal was and how to shield against it, and the war would shift into a new phase that did not require the signal but required other things, and whether that was better or worse was something she genuinely could not predict. She could not predict it, she realized, in part because she was no longer entirely sure her predictions were structured the way human predictions were structured. This was the thing she really couldn't report. She first noticed it on day 12, sitting in the pilot's seat in the hour before she'd expected to sleep. She'd been thinking about the approach vectors, not reviewing them, just thinking about them idly, the way the mind moved through familiar territory, and she'd found that the thought had a texture it hadn't had before. Not a single stream of internal narration moving through a linear sequence of logic points, but something more lateral, more simultaneous, as if multiple versions of the thought were running alongside each other in a loose harmony, and her consciousness could move between them rather than being confined to one. She had sat very still. She had thought, this is not how I used to think. She had thought this in the new way, which was recursive and strange. She had spent an hour carefully testing the edges of her cognition the way you might probe a tooth with your tongue after dental work, checking where the boundary of normal was and whether you'd found it. The processing was faster in some registers. The internal narration, the voice, her voice, the constant stream of verbal self-commentary that she had always experienced as the texture of her own mind, was quieter. Not absent, but quieter, as if it had moved to a back register, as if other kinds of thought had moved into the space it had previously occupied exclusively. She had read, years ago, about people who'd had strokes that affected specific regions of their brain and come back changed in ways that were hard to categorize as better or worse, different. Functional in new ways, limited in old ones, moved to a different relationship with their own cognition. She had thought about those accounts and thought, that is the closest analogy I have. But it wasn't quite right, because those changes were subtractive, and what she felt was not subtraction. It felt like addition. Like someone had opened a window in a house she'd lived in all her life, and now there was air moving through it that hadn't moved before, and the house was the same house, and she was the same person who lived in it, but the air was different, and she couldn't close the window, and she was not, she discovered, sitting in the pilot's seat on the long approach back to human space, sure that she wanted to. On day 14 she reached the boundary of the reach, and the quantum comms came back online. She sat with them live for a long time before she pressed the transmission key. Linden to Fleet Command. Mission complete. Tower destroyed. Signal confirmed absent. Returning on standard approach. ETA 48 hours. Mira Voss, Lieutenant Commander, mission log attached. She paused. Looked at the message. Added nothing. She sent it. The response came back in 40 minutes, Yuan's voice, raw in a way she had never heard his voice before. Mira. Thank God. Thank God. Come home. She listened to him say it. She felt something move in her, something warm that was entirely, recognizably human, that specific kind of warmth that came from being expected, being awaited, being wanted back in a specific place by specific people. She felt it clearly. She was grateful she could still feel it clearly. But underneath it, patient and oceanic and new, the other thing. The new air moving through the open window. She thought about the Mira T ships holding their positions over the collapsed tower. She thought about a species of distributed minds, 400 years of broadcasting their signal into the dark, reaching toward the universe with the only hand they had. She thought about 12,000 soldiers who had died because something vast and alien and well-intentioned had not known that some creatures could not survive an embrace. She thought about 11 survivors with rewritten minds, living in their beds in medical facilities, dreaming in patterns that weren't human patterns, and whether anyone was asking them what it had been like. Whether anyone was asking the right questions. She thought about what it meant to understand both sides of something no one else could see. She thought, I am going to have to decide what to do with this. Not now, not in the next 48 hours, not in the first week of debrief, not in the celebrations and the reports and the formal conclusion of the mission. But eventually. Some morning she would wake up and the information she was carrying would require a choice, and she would have to decide whether she was a tool that had completed its function or a person who had learned something that the world needed to know. She thought, with a new lateral quality of thought that still unsettled her when she noticed it, those are not mutually exclusive. She thought, the Mira T knew I was there. They watched me set the charges. They moved their ships clear. They could have stopped me. They didn't. She thought, why didn't they? And then she thought something she had no framework for yet, something that moved through her in a new way, along all the parallel registers simultaneously, and felt like an answer she couldn't hear clearly enough to transcribe, maybe because the tower was never only theirs. Maybe because they knew, the way they knew everything, that something that connected minds could not belong to only one kind of mind. Maybe because they understood, with the patience of 400 years, that an instrument broken on its first use is not a failed instrument. Maybe because they are waiting to try again. She sat in the pilot seat of the Linden and watched the stars and let this thought be the shape it was. The internal voice, her voice, human and wry and self-aware, surfaced after a moment. You're getting philosophical. You haven't eaten in 6 hours. You're approaching Fleet Command in 2 days and you look like you've been through something you can't fully describe. You should eat. You should sleep. You should decide what you're going to say in the debrief when they ask if there are any health effects to report from signal exposure. She almost smiled. No effects to report, she would say, looking steadily at whoever was asking, and she would not be lying, precisely, because whatever had shifted in her did not feel like an effect. An effect was something that happened to you. This felt like something that had been there all along, waiting for the right frequency to wake it. She went to the galley. She ate. She slept. And the dreams were strange but not frightening. They were the dreams of someone who had grown a new sense and was learning to see with it. 47 hours later, the Linden docked at Fleet Command Station Ethon. The docking bay was full of people, more than she'd expected, rank insignia from 4 different command divisions, the particular kind of crowd that assembled around an event that would be written into history. She could see Yuan through the viewport before she unsealed the hatch. He was looking at the Linden with an expression that was too complicated for a single name. She checked her face in the small mirror above the pilot's seat. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had done a difficult thing and survived it. She looked, she thought, like herself, the same angular face and dark eyes and the slight structural differences in her bone structure that marked her dual inheritance, the thing she'd always looked at in mirrors with complicated feelings, the marks of the betweenness that had defined and limited and, finally, made her useful. She looked like herself. She felt like someone who had learned what herself was. She opened the hatch. The sound of the station rushed in, voices, systems, the mechanical percussion of a working installation, the smell of humans in numbers, all those sealed minds moving through their sealed orbits, broadcasting their interior lives into the private void of their own skulls, alone and loud and valiant in their aloneness. She breathed it in. She loved it. She loved them. She loved them with a specificity she hadn't felt before, the way you loved something you now understood from the outside. She walked down the ramp and Ewan met her at the bottom and shook her hand, and behind his grip she felt the tremor of a man who was trying not to weep with relief, and she felt this with her human senses and her human heart and the new lateral thinking of the other thing she was becoming, and she filed all three versions simultaneously, and she said, "Admiral," and he said her name, and the bay erupted in something that was more than applause, something that was also relief and grief and the desperate human need to declare that something was over. She smiled. She stood straight. She accepted what was given. And in the silence at the center of herself, the silence where the signal had been, where its absence had carved a space that was not empty but open, she held everything she was not yet saying, everything she did not yet know how to say, everything that would matter most and that she would take her time with, because she was patient in ways she had not been patient before, and some frequencies required care. The celebration went on around her, loud and warm and human. She stood in it. She was part of it. She kept the silence, and waited, and thought in the new way, which was also the old way, which was also hers, and it moved through her like a signal through a willing receiver, slowly, completely, like something finally arriving home.